Okay, I just wanted to finish one final aura about Yaakov and the angel and the Gid HaNosheh. And we should not forget the most obvious symbolism of the whole story, and that is the Sefer HaChinuch says that night is a remez to Golus, right? Night is called Golus, a time of where God doesn't seem to be here with us. And what Hashem is telling Yaakov Avinu is that there will be a long, long night of Golus in which the powers will try to destroy you. And sometimes you will be defeated because there are times in which the angel of Esav is victorious. But Hashem promises Yaakov that there's going to be a morning, there's going to be a dawn, that there will be a brightness after this darkness. And we will not emerge whole. Yaakov emerges limping, which means to say when Moshiach finally comes, Klal Yisrael has been put through the ringer, whether it's the Crusades or the pogroms or the Holocaust or these situations we're facing now. So Yaakov is limping, but Yaakov will ultimately be triumphant. And not only will he be triumphant, but the very forces that try to destroy him will give him a blessing. That's very, very significant. That, in fact, the idea is that the Esav that tried to destroy you during the night will come and give you a bracha. This is why Chazal say, Liyasid Lavai, Yishmael will do tshuva. Because remember, the historical Yishmael actually did tshuva. Because it says that when Avram died, Yitzchak and Yishmael were Isaac in his kavura, and Rashi says Yishmael did tshuva. So there is a Maimer Chazal that says that the same way that Yishmael as a person did tshuva by the end of his life, the Bnei Yishmael are also going to do tshuva bi'acharis hayamim. Now some say, the Meshech Chochmah actually says that the first stage in that tshuva, as amazingly as it is, because it was quite a long time ago, and they've done many Averas since then, was the conversion of the nomadic Arabs to Islam. That Islam, as hateful a religion as it is in so many ways, is a monotheistic religion that moved away from the paganism that the Bedouins had prior to that. So that is the first step of Yishmael doing tshuva, is that they formally embrace the worship of one God. Some look at the second stage as the so-called Abrahamic Accords, where you had Dubai and Emirates, United Arab Emirates, making peace with Israel, and the idea of Saudi Arabia, right? You go to Dubai, I think there are 2 kosher restaurants and a Chabad house and some other things. There's a chief rabbi of Saudi Arabia. Now, one of the side effects of the Hamas war that we're going through, which may be of secondary importance, but it's still significant, is that all of the developing peace with other Arab nations is now put on hold, because at least officially they have to go with their people, even though emotionally I don't think they're actually there. But once again, one can look at the Abrahamic Accords in a cynical way, which has a lot of truth to it. It's a matter of money, it's a matter of economics, it's a matter of making peace with Israel is good for business, which it certainly is. Or one can also look at it in a spiritual way, that it's kind of yet another stage in the eventual tshuva of Yishmael. So we do have the role of Yishmael b'acharis hayamim is a contradictory role. On one hand, Rav Chaim Vital tells us that there will be the final stage of the wars of Gog and Magog, and this will be Golus Yishmael, and Golus Yishmael will be the most difficult Golus, full of persecution, full of destruction. And there'll be that aspect. And side by side, there'll be an opposite aspect of Yishmael moving to tshuva. And the truth is, we see it in the world. We see these 2 different movements of Yishmael doing tshuva and Yishmael engaged in violence and destruction and death. So both things are happening, mamish, in our own time. Now, there is another Maimer Chazal that even Esav, on some level, will come to do tshuva b'acharis hayamim. Now, this doesn't mean all of Esav, but some of Esav. So essentially, this all goes back to Hashem's bracha to Avram Avinu, that like all of your children will at some point be righteous, because Yishmael is from Avram and Esav is Avram's grandson, and they will all ultimately come back to the fold. So the Sefer HaChinuch says, every time you refrain from eating a sirloin steak, meaning whenever you refrain from the Gid HaNosha, you're reminded and you're affirming your belief that after the bitterness of the Galus will come a day of redemption. And in that day of redemption, even the umos that tried to destroy you will acknowledge your greatness and will give you a bracha, as well. And this we see in the famous prophecies of Yeshayahu Hanavi that we say during Selichos, right? We say it every day during Selichos. V'haviosim al har kodshi, that Hashem will bring all the nations to His holy mountain, and they will worship Hashem in Yerushalayim. It doesn't mean they'll become Jewish. In point of fact, once Moshiach comes, we don't accept Gerim. You have to convert before Moshiach comes. But it means they'll acknowledge Hashem, and they'll acknowledge the special role of the Jewish people, and they will serve Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash. You know, going all the way back to Shlomo HaMelech. When Shlomo HaMelech dedicated the first Beis HaMikdash, he offered a very, very long dedicatory prayer. There's a very, very long tefillah that Shlomo HaMelech offered on his knees. Interesting question. We don't go on our knees today, but there was a time that Jewish worship was mamish on one's knees. And in that dedicatory prayer, that prayer in the Chanukah Sabayis of the Beis HaMikdash, there's quite a lot of space devoted to the fact that even the non-Jew who is not of Bnei Yisrael will turn to this place, to this Beis HaMikdash, and will seek communion with Hashem. Right? It's in the Psukim. Look in Malachim Aleph, you'll see that he specifically calls the Beis HaMikdash a makam of tefillah for all of the umos ha'olam. By the way, as a little aside, the dedication of the first Beis HaMikdash was a 14-day dedication. 14 days they dedicated, they celebrated. And the last of the 14th day was Shmini Atzeres. So the obvious question is this: if you go backwards from Shmini Atzeres, count 14 days, so Yom Kippur is included as one of the days of the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash, and Chazal actually say that year they actually ate on Yom Kippur, that the Simcha of Chanukah Sabayis had overridden the Chiyuv to fast on Yom Kippur. And that's a raya, because we know the last day was Shmini Atzeres, that was 14 days, right? So from Shmini Atzeres, 14 days, that takes you to before Yom Kippur. And that was the Zman of the Chanukah Sabayis. So that was the final point I just wanted to bring out. Emunah in Geula, and understanding that even in the darkness of Galus, there will eventually be a dawn, and that is the great symbol of Yaakov struggling with the Malach. As the Ramban writes, we have a very important klal in all of Sefer Bereshis. Maise avos simin labanim. Whatever happens to our avos is a sign as to what will happen to the nation as a whole. Right? So everything of the avos has a parallel. So the Ramban takes this throughout Chumash Bereshis. When Avram goes to Mitzrayim because of a famine, that's a foreshadowing that we're going to go to Mitzrayim because of a famine. When Avram leaves Mitzrayim with great wealth that Paro gave him, that's a remez to the idea that we will leave Mitzrayim with great wealth, indeed, which we did. The Ramban says we're going to read in 2 weeks of Yitzchak digging wells, and it mentions he dug one well, or his staff, his shepherds, dug a well, and it was filled up. Right, the Philistines filled it up, and then a second well that was filled up, and then a third well was not filled up. So the Ramban says that's a remez. The Beis HaMikdash is called a well of gushing water. And the idea that the first 2 wells get filled up is a remez. There will be a Chorban Bayis Rishain and a Chorban Bayis Sheni, but the Bayis Shalishi will never be Nechrav. And even the names of the wells, when the first well got filled up, so Yitzchak called it Asek. Asek is quarrelsome, but that's a term that's used for Avodah Zarah, because that's a remez that the first Beis HaMikdash will be destroyed because of a fighting we have with God, Avodah Zarah, as well as Gilei Raya Shvichas Damim. The second well that was filled up was called Sitna. Sitna is hatred. And that's a remez to the Siba for the Churban Bayis Sheni, which was Sinat Chinam. And the third well, which was not filled up, was called Rechovot, just like the city in Israel named after that well. God has given us expansiveness. And that's a remez to the third Beis HaMikdash, where Yerushalayim itself will be greatly expanded. And there will never be a Churban. There will never be a Churban again. Again, it's actually quite complicated. You know, if you look at the end of the book of Yechezkel, so how does it work? The description of the Mishkan is, of course, in the Torah. That's Parshas Truma Tetzaveh. Okay, that's the Mishkan. The description of the first Beis HaMikdash that Shlomo HaMelech built is, of course, in the book of Malachim. Malachim gives us, I mean, it's complicated because, you know, it would have been easier if Nach would have pictures in it, but in our Tanakh there's no pictures. Later people have to supply them based on Meforshim, but it's not a simple thing. But be it as it may, the blueprint, the prose blueprint of the first Beis HaMikdash is in the book of Malachim. Now, after that, the only detailed blueprint we have of a Beis HaMikdash is in the book of Yechezkel. Now, it's very, very interesting. Everybody will always say, oh, the book of Yechezkel is describing the third Beis HaMikdash, which is true. But you have to understand that's not necessarily how people understood it at the time. Meaning, the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, and Yechezkel is giving them a vision of what the new Beis HaMikdash will look like. In theory, the Beis HaMikdash he is describing could have been the second Beis HaMikdash. Meaning, there was a possibility that the end of the Babylonian exile, after 70 years, Moshiach would come, and we would have the eternal Beis HaMikdash. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of feeling. I mean, if you look at the Nevuos of Zechariah, they are talking about the redemption from Babylon in very messianic terms. So one thing that you have to understand is, when you learn Nach, and maybe I'm digressing a little bit, is you can't always learn it in retrospect, meaning you can't, if you're trying to understand what the Navi is talking about, if you're trying to understand the feelings of the people, don't assume that they know all the future history that we know as it unfolded. They did not know necessarily there would be a Churban Bayis Sheni. When the Navi Yechezkel is telling them there'll be a redemption and there'll be a Beis HaMikdash, that could have been in their minds, maybe even in the Navi's minds. Hashem redeeming us from Baba, absolutely. What happened was, it didn't pan out. And why was that so? It's very interesting. The Malbim has a whole arichos in which he suggests that because only a minority of Jews returned when Koresh let them come back, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu said they were not worthy of a full redemption. Had more Jews returned to Eretz Yisrael, that could have made a tremendous difference. So as a result, the eternal binyan of Yechezkel became the transient second Beis HaMikdash, which actually does not follow Yechezkel's blueprint. And the reason it does not follow Yechezkel's blueprint is it was understood that Yechezkel's blueprint is for the eternal Beis HaMikdash of Moshiach. Now, and therefore the actual blueprint of the second Beis HaMikdash is not found in Tanakh at all. We know that in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah it was a simple structure. I mean, it had the Kodesh HaKodashim, it had all the basic things you had in the Mishkan, but it was a very simple structure. And then later, Herod greatly expanded it, and the description in the whole tractate of Mishnayos, which is Maseches Midas, is essentially a description of the Herodian temple. But the Herodian temple, as the Rambam explains, was a combination of things taken from the first Beis HaMikdash and taken from Yechezkel's Beis HaMikdash. It was a composite, but it was not totally Yechezkel's blueprint, because Yechezkel's blueprint is limited to the third Beis HaMikdash. So the point I want to make is that the common statement that people make, that the blueprint at the end of the book of Yechezkel is the third Beis HaMikdash, we only know that in hindsight. We didn't know that at the time. In fact, Yechezkel may not have known it at the time. When Yechezkel is communicating this nevuah, what people are hearing is this is going to be the Beis HaMikdash we're going to have when Hashem takes us out of Bavel, and only when it was realized pretty early on, after some of the Jews returned, this was not going to be redemption. Then they had to modify their plan and not go with Yechezkel. Nevertheless, in spite of what I just said, you see from the Ramban. So it's interesting, how did people view that? There is an allusion to the notion that the two temples are going to be destroyed in the fact that Yitzchak's two wells were filled up. One was called Asek, quarreling with God. The other was called Sitna, hatred. And only the third well was able to remain, and that's called Rechovot. God gave us expansiveness. So the point I'm making is, I know I'm contradicting myself actually, but it's an interesting point, and that is, even though it may not have been known to the people that the second temple would have been destroyed, because there was a belief that this might be the redemption, at least retrospectively, the Ramban says, we have a remez in the Torah to the notion of two temples being destroyed, the third temple not being destroyed. Now, people ask, again, maybe this is not the time or place to discuss this. We have this tradition that there's only two Guluses, right? We were exiled by the Babylonians, and then we came back, and we were exiled by the Romans. So people say there will never be a third Galus, and therefore we are guaranteed that, God forbid, the Jewish people will never be kicked out of the land of Israel again. Now, again, maybe this is not the appropriate time to bring it up. I'm bringing it up just because Torahi, B'lilmod ani tzarich. If one were to ask the question from the standpoint of Nevuah, is there a guarantee that the state of Israel will endure? The short answer is there is no guarantee, and the reason is the following. It is true that the Nevi'im tell us very much beferish that the Jewish people will only be exiled twice, at least in retrospect, and not a third time. But the problem is we're not out of the second Galus yet. The second Galus began with the Churban Beis HaMikdash. The establishment of the state of Israel did not end the second Galus. Maybe it was a step towards ending it, but the second Galus does not end until we have a Beis HaMikdash and Moshiach comes. So the notion that there will not be a third Galus is very true once the second Galus ends. But until the second Galus ends, we are still in a second Galus. We are still in the Galus of the year 70 of the Common Era. Again, the establishment of the State of Israel, even if you're a Messianic Zionist, and even if you say it's Aschalta de Geula, let's even say that, although I don't want to lose my job over it. Even if you say that, let's call it Aschalta de Geula. Baruch Hashem. But Aschalta de Geula is not Geula, which means we're still in Galus. If we're still in Galus, then anything can happen. All right, so again, of course, our tefillas, our prayers, is Hashem should have rachamim, and all of us have to daven for that. But you can't pose it in terms of guarantees. You can't put it in terms of guarantee, because the only guarantee is once Moshiach comes and once there's a third Beis HaMikdash, it will never be destroyed. There will never be a Golus again. But until you reach that point, anything can happen. Yeah.
Was there ever a possible Havamina in the timeline that Shiloh would be counted as the first, and so the third would be Zerubbabel? Is that ever a valid Havamina in the timeline?
Well, let me put it this way. The idea that Zerubbabel was potentially regarded as Moshiach is absolutely the case. And if you read Zerubbabel was the governor, so to speak, of the Jewish population that returned to Eretz Yisrael. Ezra and Nehemiah came later, but Zerubbabel was actually the governor, and Zerubbabel was very involved in building the simple structure of the second Beis Hamikdash. But if you look at Zechariah, it's absolutely inescapable that Zechariah believed that Zerubbabel was Moshiach. I mean, he spoke about Zerubbabel in absolutely messianic terms, when in fact, as far as the biblical record is concerned, Zerubbabel, I mean, he was a very important person, but Zerubbabel was, a governor over a small population in which he took care of a struggling group of Jews that were trying to make it. It did not have the grandiosity, it did not have the glory of messianism. Now, you want to suggest that maybe the way we factor in Zerubbabel is that we count Shiloh as number one, and which is more than 300 years. Then Shlomo's Mikdash number two. That makes Zerubbabel number three. So you want to suggest that maybe that's the reason? Possibly. Again, I was saying it a different way. I was saying it's because that way your answer we could still preserve the remez of the wells.
Yes.
See, I was learning that they didn't know it had to be number three. They thought it could be number two. And then what I was saying is I didn't know how they would deal with the remez of the wells. You're suggesting that the remez of the wells could still fit in because we count Shiloh as number one. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good way of preserving the potential remez. Yeah.
Very much on that. Is there any way that we, depending on how history develops, sort of, as a result of that, learn things differently? Like what was suggested just now. Could it have been, does it have to be that particular remez was always learned and it would fit with history, or perhaps we wouldn't have learned that?
Yeah. I mean, again, the idea might be that different remezim can have many, many different meanings, and depending on how history develops, the remez itself could be redefined in different ways. Meaning, sometimes you see the significance of the remez only as history unfolded, and not necessarily ahead of time. So that's possible as well. Now, I will say though, there is one remez. Besides the wells, there may be a more direct remez to the notion that we understood from the very beginning that the second temple would not endure, and that's from the book of Daniel. And this is actually a very, very famous prophecy. Well, the word prophecy is a strange word because we know the book of Daniel is not in the books of Nevi'im. The book of Daniel is in the Kesuvim. And I think I mentioned it a number of times before. Why is Daniel relegated to Kesuvim? I mean, if we look at a Navi as somebody who sees the future, there is absolutely no question that Daniel had tremendously detailed visions about the unfolding of Jewish history all the way to the Messianic era. No question. In fact, Daniel gives you dates and calculations, which all the Rishonim are trying to figure out, but all sorts of messianic calculations in the book of Daniel. So why is he not a Navi? So I think I told you that the definition of a Navi is not simply somebody who sees the future, but somebody who is commanded with a mission to communicate messages from God, either to Jews, which is the normal case, or in the case of Yonah is actually a rare case, he was given a mission to communicate to the Gentiles, to the city of Nineveh. Daniel was given no communication. Hashem showed him visions. Hashem showed him the future. Daniel wrote it down, but God never commanded him to tell anybody about it. So as a result, Daniel might be called a chozeh. Chozeh means a visionary. Daniel is not a Navi. Okay, this is a very common misconception. What makes you a Navi is not what you see. What makes you a Navi is whether you are commanded to communicate your vision.
Possible for a goy to become a Navi in this way?
Well, become a Navi in the sense of seeing things?
Well,
or
there are reports from the Greeks of prophetesses and people having these sorts of revelations.
Well, it may be possible. I mean, obviously, Bilam was a prophet that Hashem sent to the nations, even to communicate. Other types of nevuas, may be false. I mean, the idea of a false Navi is a very, very common theme in Tanakh, and the false Nevi'im came in two flavors. There were false Nevi'im who prophesied in the name of Avodah Zarah, but there were many, many, many false Nevi'im who prophesied in the name of God. Right? But both of them are Navi Sheker. Yeah.
Why did the Rishonim talk about why Daniel was given this power of
Yeah, so why? So, I don't think anyone specifically says it. I mean, the one phrase that Hashem uses throughout the book of Daniel, he is called Daniel Ish Chamudot. Daniel, the precious and beloved one. It seems to have been a gift, so to speak. Now, Daniel lived, just to be sure you get the time frame here. Daniel was exiled to Babylonia well before the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. He was the very first wave, because Babylonia had conquered Eretz Israel, but did not destroy the Beis Hamikdash until 19 years after their conquest. So Daniel was exiled as a teenager to Babylonia to serve in the king's court. Nebuchadnezzar wanted some talented Jewish kids to be trained as couriers and pages and the like. And Daniel was with his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the book of Daniel says they kept kosher, their vegetarian diets, all sorts of things that they did not. Again, it took a lot of willpower because there were no other frum Jews there. They were the only ones that were there. And so Daniel lived before the Churban, although he lived after it as well. He lived for a very long time, but the book of Daniel is largely before the Churban Beis Hamikdash, before the Churban Bayis Rishon, before the Churban Bayis Rishon, and yet he is given all sorts of visions, and among his visions is the following statement. And I'm taking it out of context because to truly understand it, there's a lot of psukim there, but it says 70 weeks have been decreed on your people. 70 weeks have been decreed on your people. And the way Chazal interprets 70 weeks, a week refers to 7 years, a week of years, not a week of days. So 70 weeks equals 490 years. That Daniel is being given a message that there's a 490-year period, and the way Chazal interpret it is between the destruction of the first temple, Mikdash, and the destruction of the second temple will be a period of 490 years. Now, this is true. How many years were there between the Churban Bayis Rishon and the building of the Bayis Sheni? 70 years. How many years did the Bayis Sheni stand until it was destroyed by the Romans? 420 years. So 70 plus 420 is 490, and these are the 70 weeks that God has decreed on Jerusalem. Now, if you understand it that way, then we already have in Daniel's Maros the notion that the second Beis Hamikdash is going to be destroyed. Nevertheless, it could very well be that given the fact that Daniel was not commanded to tell anybody this, people didn't know it, so they still could have thought the second Beis Hamikdash might have been the Messianic temple. But as I say, it's not only the Ramban's remez of the wells that may negate that. In fact, your answer doesn't work for the Daniel thing. Your answer about Shiloh may answer the Ramban's raya from the wells. But here, Daniel refers to 490 years. So it's complicated, but the one thing we can say for sure is there was a messianic hope, but that messianic hope never panned out. It never panned out. In many, many ways, the whole Tekufah of the Bayit Sheni was an enormous disappointment. Baruch Hashem, we have a Beis Hamikdash, but it didn't become what it became. And again, the Malbim locates that in the fact that so many Jews did not come back to Eretz Israel when they had the opportunity. Okay. Alrighty, so how did I get onto this? Oh, yeah, I was just saying, Maisa Ava Siman Labanim, that what happens to the Avos is a siman for the future generations. So that also applies even to Esav and Yishmael. And therefore Chazal say, just as Yishmael did tshuva as a person, Yishmael will do tshuva. There's another Chazal that even says Esav too will become reconciled with Yaakov. So, B'ezras Hashem, we should be zachar to see that. Yeah.
So, regarding Daniel, it's possible for someone to receive a vision, and it's up to them whether to publicize it. It's their choice.
So it depends. If you're a Navi, then by definition you are commanded to communicate. if you're not a Navi, so unless Hashem says you may not say this, you do have the right to talk about it. Now, on the other hand, Hashem did say to Daniel, and it's hard to know the exact implications. He said to Daniel, Satom hadvarim, keep these matters concealed or obscure. So that seems to be that even if you communicate, do not fully explain the significance. So it's not clear. You could learn the pasuk, this is your private thing. Of course, that raises the obvious question. If Hashem said keep it private, then who made it public? Like, why do we have a book of Daniel? Meaning, Hashem said keep it private. So somebody, who's the somebody? Sorry, Anshe Knesset Agdola. Somebody said, hey, let's publish this. That's a good question. But the other interpretation of Satom does not mean don't publicize it, but it means don't explain it, meaning leave it in a very obscure, indeterminate way. And that's true. The book of Daniel, we have the book of Daniel, but it's written in a very obscure, difficult, that's why we can't really decipher it. Yeah.
Was there any opinion to not include Daniel in the Tanakh?
You know, it's interesting. I don't believe there is. You know, there are a number of books of Tanakh in which there were Chachamim that wanted to exclude it. Shir HaShirim almost didn't make it. Banned in Boston. They wanted to censor Shir HaShirim because it's too erotic, too romantic. Rabbi Akiva was the big defense attorney for Shir HaShirim by saying it's a metaphor of divine love. Koheles, another work by Shlomo HaMelech, almost didn't make it. Because in Koheles, unlike, let's say, Mishlei, which is a very frum book, Mishlei, talks about God, but Shir HaShirim has, not Shir HaShirim, Koheles, at least, if you read the psukim at random, says things like, man and animal are the same, everybody's dead and there's nothing is after death, and life is worthless. Now, so the Chachamim said, hey, what do we need this stuff? This is Greek philosophy or whatever it is. Now, the thing is, though, eventually it was decided that this is more of a debating style, meaning you have to understand this is something that's a little uncomfortable, that when philosophical issues about life are discussed, so positions will be stated that are actually apikorsis, but then they're modified and answered and refuted. So Koheles is a book of musings, a book of thoughts, like when you're thinking about something, so different things hit you, and then you refute them. So Koheles does end with the idea that Sof Devorah Kol Nishma, the only thing that's important in life is to fear Hashem and serve Hashem and the like. So there were Chachamim who actually felt that because individual verses were heretical, taken on their own, we got to passel the book. Others said, no. The book of Yecheskel, which has tremendous nevuos. Maisa Merkava, the divine chariot. There were people who didn't want to bring it in because when Yecheskel describes the services of the third temple and the korbanos he sets up are totally different than the korbanos in Vayikra. He's changing, again, literally, he's changing the mitzvahs of the Torah. You can't do that, right? The Torah is eternal. So once again, Chazal interpret the psukim that what appears like a change is not a change, right? But so I know that Koheles, Shir HaShirim, and Yecheskel, there were those who wanted to exclude it. Shir HaShirim because of its romantic content, Koheles because of its philosophical nihilism at different points, and Yecheskel primarily for halachic reasons, because he sets up literally a halachic structure that violates the Torah. But as far as I know, the book of Daniel, I don't think was ever, nobody ever contested the inclusion of Daniel in the canon, because it was simply understood that, hey, it gives us, there are two different parts of Daniel. Actually, it's very equally divided. It's 12 prakim, and there's 6 prakim and 6. The first 6 are biographical detail, and the second 6 are messianic visions. So the lesson of the first 6 is Mesiras Nefesh in times of persecution. So it was a very important lesson, that Daniel was thrown into the lion's den rather than bow down to Avodah Zarah. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were willing to go into the fiery furnace. Even as teenagers, they would not eat any treif, even though it could have been pikuach nefesh for them, right? So one reason why Daniel was treated as a very, very important work was because it really was a guide to be strong in your emunah in times of persecution. And the second reason why Daniel was included is because in the second half of the book, it just reminds us of the Geula and the Moshiach, and he will come, and the like. So interestingly enough, I don't think there was any accusations of heresy against the book of Daniel, even though it's a very obscure book. Now, it has a very interesting history. Maybe it'll be another time we could even learn the book of Daniel. I don't know, something to consider. And that is all the Rishonim, starting from the Gaonim, they tried to figure out. Daniel gives you formulas. Mashiach will come with this date and that date and that date, but how you counted, where you counted from, everything was up in the air. So starting from Afsad Yagon, if not earlier, different commentaries, Rashi, Ramban, Afsad Yagon. The last one who tried it was the Malbim in the 19th century. They tried to come up with the dates of Mashiach based on the book of Daniel. And it's always like 50 to 100 years from wherever you are. Mm-hmm. So Rav Saadia Gaon said 50 years from now, in the 900s. Rashi said 50 years from him. Ramban said 50 years from him. Malbim came up with 1928, or the Great Depression, or something, which again, around 50 years from him. What happens is, and in fact, Rashi himself comments. Rashi brings Rav Saadia Gaon's calculations and says, B'avonosenu harabim, this man is avar, so we have to reinterpret it to mean something else. And that's what happens. So eventually it was understood, as Chazal say, in fact the whole Kasha, Chazal say, we're not supposed to calculate messianic dates. So what's going on? So you see that this was almost an irresistible Yetzer Hara, almost, to give Klal Yisrael potential comfort. The Rambam writes in a letter about Mashiach and the like. The Rambam writes, we are absolutely not allowed to calculate messianic times. It is forbidden. You don't do it. It's not proper. But then he says, but I got to tell you something I received from my father as a tradition, who received, right after the Rambam said not to do it, the Rambam comes up with something as if to say, but I'll tell you. I can't say it's a certainty, but just be aware of this possibility. So you have to understand that when Yidden are suffering, and this offers them a comfort, something to look forward to. So maybe I shouldn't say it this way, but the rules get bent a little bit. But the problem is, and this is why Chazal didn't like this so much, and that is, you come up with dates, and you tell people, in 50 years Moshiach is coming. So that's going to really give you a lot of comfort for 50 years. But what's going to happen the 51st year when Mashiach didn't come? Meaning, you might be making things a lot worse with messianic predictions that don't come to pass than if you didn't make the prediction at all. In other words, you're buying what might be a very short-term hope and encouragement, setting people up to devastation if that is not the right time. And all of us know that we don't know for sure. The Gaonim themselves were makir. They didn't know for sure that this would be the case. And it gets complicated as well, because even if their calculations were right, it may depend on our zechus as well. So things get recalibrated, things get reformulated. In other words, the nevuos are written in a way that it could be an earlier date, could be a later date, depending on Klal Yisrael. So even Rav Saadia Gaon, in other words, if you ask me, was Rav Saadia Gaon wrong? Was Rashi wrong? Was Ramban wrong? No. They were coming up with potential days of revelation based on open-ended prophecies that could have taken many, many different forms. So nobody's wrong. We would be wrong if we just made up our thing, but these great Gedolim, they were not wrong. But what happens is that, it's an open-ended prophecy that has several possible ways of being manifest. And that depends on the Zechus of Klal Yisrael or other cheshbonos that might be beyond us. So that's the way Nevuah often works. Nevuahs of this nature are subject to multiple interpretations, all of which are possibilities. It's not, is it this or is it that? All of them are possibilities, but things change. Things change in time based on zechus and the like. So that's why the idea, in fact, the story of Yaakov Kamenetsky about just as he was such a practical person, he had such a sense of real life that there was a businessman in Toronto, Rav Yaakov had been a Rav in Toronto, who was a Machal Shabbos. He had his business open on Shabbos. And somebody managed to convince him that Moshiach is coming. He said, what are you going to do when Moshiach comes? And you'll be a Machal Shabbos. You're going to be so shamed and punished and rejected. And, Moshiach, there are calculations. Moshiach may come, in a month from now. What are you going to do? So for some reason, the guy got so excited with Moshiach coming that he closed his business. And he became a Shomer Shabbos. So Rav Yaakov told somebody, I don't remember all the details, go and tell the man we don't know if Mashiach is coming. Go and tell the man we don't know. We said he was coming in a month, we don't know. So they said, well, what do you mean? I said, we don't know. The guy might stop doing what he's doing. He says, listen, you tell him Mashiach is coming, he's going to be frum for 2 weeks. What happens when Mashiach doesn't come? He'll be a lot more antagonistic to Yiddishkeit than if he knew ahead of time that we don't know. So you don't lure people in with false promises in which in the short term, you may get them to do mitzvot. In the long term, there'll be a lot of resentment. So Rav Yaakov actually said, diffuse the messianic fervor. So, try to make the guy a Shomer Shabbos by being makar of him, but not by making all sorts of promises or assurances that you have no idea are going to come to pass. That's why sometimes, it's understandable, but even here in Eretz Yisrael, there's a messianic fervor, not just in this war, but, before. If you've been here long enough, you know that there's always this statement like, Moshiach is coming next month. When he doesn't come, Moshiach is coming next month. There's a constant notion. You can check, if you check the internet, check the different blogs and all of this stuff, you will find messianic predictions for like every month of the year for the past 50 years. And, it passes, whatever. So the only realistic idea is we are in the period of Chavlei Mashiach. I think that's pretty safe. This is Chavlei Mashiach. But a pregnancy can be long, 9 months, and how you translate that on the national level. It could be 9 centuries, whatever it would be. So we are in Chavlei Mashiach. We are in Ikvasit Mashiach. That much I think we can absolutely say. But to put durations on it, we just don't have the koach. We just can't do it. And sometimes it is actually a disservice to try to be more exact. And that's why Hashem told Daniel that keep it a secret a little bit. Don't be mefarsim necessarily all of the meaning of when it will come. Now, it is interesting. There is a letter. This is fascinating, and people are working on it. The Vilna Gaon left a letter to be opened after his death. And we have the letter. I don't remember it. The letter makes no sense in the sense you read it. It's a string of different letters and some words, but it doesn't communicate any sentence that we could really understand. But the Vilna Gaon says, this is the secret of when Mashiach will come. So the Vilna Gaon left a letter telling you when Mashiach would come, but he wrote it in such an obscure way that people are going crazy to try to figure it out. We have the letter. I can give you the letter. Try to figure it out. Although, just to show you something, that Rebbe Elyashiv's grandfather, it's called the Leshem, Rav Shlomo Elyashiv. The Leshem was a tremendous, great makubal. You've heard of the Baal HaLeshem, Rebbe Elyashiv's grandfather. That when he saw the Vilna Gaon's letter, he said, anyone that knows Kabbalah well, it's Pashut. The Vilna Gaon is it's a very simple letter to understand. That's what the Baal HaLeshem said. It says, Baruch Hashem. So apparently there were people in the world who understood the letter b'diuk, but I can tell you that I think for the vast majority of us, we would have no idea what it says. If you want, I'll get you the letter. You can work on it yourself and see if it makes any sense. Okay, we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome Mech production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.